peak of what would be called the golden age of comics. And why not? In the comic books, the Americans always won.
The war in the comic books looked like something that was kind of fun. And the striking contrast between that and the war itself must have bothered some people.
The superheroes fought two kinds of Japanese, buck-toothed and fanged. But while the Japanese and Nazis were both portrayed as sadistic monsters, the Nazis' ultimate horror was never mentioned.
Certainly it was an opportunity to talk about the Holocaust, which everybody knew was beginning to happen. But nobody in comics would attempt it because I think essentially you felt that your audience wouldn't be interested in that. They wouldn't understand it.
There was a sort of irony in the fact that these characters, many of whom in that period in the Golden Age had been evolved to fight the Nazis, were themselves very much in the Nazi ideal. The idea that you can solve problems through physical strength, by being stronger and more dominating, more powerful, that is fascism. I mean, that's it. That's the essence of fascism. And I don't think the creators of superheroes or the kids who were reading at the time were the slightest bit aware of it.
To one character, fascism was just another example of male aggression. But then, everything about Wonder Woman was different.
Wonder Woman was a particularly interesting character, created by a psychologist.
Charles Moulton was really Dr. William Moulton Marston, an author, one of the inventors of the lie detector, and an early defender of comics. The Harvard-educated Marston was hired by DC as a consultant.
The honcho hired him to think of a way to do a female Superman. Why not go after the girl audience? And Marston apparently decided to do it himself.
He came in probably as the first established writer to move into doing comics.
Marston began the saga in 1941. As a wounded intelligence officer, Steve Trevor crash lands on the island home of the immortal Amazons. The Queen's daughter, Princess Diana, falls in love with the helpless man. Her love makes her realize that the Amazons face the same decision other isolationists and pacifists face in 1941. Try to ignore the Nazis or fight for freedom. Against her mother's protests, Diana goes back with Steve to defend America, described by the goddess Athena as the last citadel of democracy and equal rights for women. Like Superman, Wonder Woman was more powerful than a locomotive, and she had better gadgets than Batman. An invisible plane, a telepathic tiara, a magic lasso that forced people to obey her, and bulletproof bracelets.
Wonder Woman was a great success. The female aspect was very heavily played. The artist, H.G. Peter, however, had a very masculine approach. Artistically, it appealed to male readers.
Something else might have appealed to male readers. Wonder Woman lost her power and free will if men bound her bracelets together.
There was definitely an S&M quality about the appeal of Wonder Woman.
Almost every book was riddled with female domination, bondage, subjugation, punishment, and loads of fetishes.
Back then, I guess nobody got it.
Certainly, no readers at the time knew of Marston's unconventional home life. He lived happily with his wife and their children, and a former student who always wore metal bracelets on both wrists, and their children. Despite his avant-garde lifestyle, Marston had Wonder Woman give down-to-earth advice for kids on the home front, urging them to collect old paper and scrap metal, which could be recycled into war material for soldiers overseas. Other patriotic heroes also promoted collecting scrap or buying war bonds, and some even made financial sacrifices to do so.
Captain America requested kids not to send a dime for the membership card and the tin badge, but to spend a dime for war bonds. You know, every dime you spend may be the dime that puts a bullet in the last Jap in the war.
Here, Captain America's sidekick urges kids to collect scrap paper for the war effort. Little did he realize, That request would turn comic books from 10-cent trash into eventual treasure.
World War II created the collector's market to some extent, because when they were looking for paper, the first thing that Mom wanted to throw out was those damn comic books. And so when you go and find a Golden Age book that's selling for $6,000, you can thank World War II for that.
At the time, none of the young artists or writers dreamed that their work would one day be so valuable. They were too busy cranking out stories or leaving the business altogether to go to war.
I felt I can't be writing about all these comic book heroes and not be fighting myself. When the artists and writers went off to war, the publishers had to give the strips to different artists and different writers, and the publishers began to feel that they were in charge of these characters. The characters became corporate characters, controlled more by the corporation.
The readers also seemed to want a little calm and stability after 16 years of depression and war. So the heroes began losing their edge.
By 1945, Batman was an establishment figure. He carried a platinum badge.
Superman went through a change as a sort of outside loner into the ultimate lawful authority.
Ironically, just as superheroes got blander, post-war politicians attacked them as threats to the very foundation of the country. In the 1950s, comic book superheroes would face their greatest battle, not against a mad scientist or a foreign army, but against the United States Senate. Comic books reached their greatest popularity in the early 50s. The paper rationing of the war years was no longer mandated. Nevertheless, average monthly sales climbed from 25 million in 1943 to almost 100 million in 1953. But if the industry was doing well, superheroes weren't. Readers were now more interested in other genres: funny animals, teen comedies, westerns, gangsters, and horror stories.
Superheroes were so closely tied in with, first of all, the culture of the New Deal and then the World War II culture, that they had trouble surviving.
When the war was over, the enemy was beaten. We didn't need superheroes anymore.
Not only had the GIs changed their tastes and grown more sophisticated, but the guys who were making the comics were tired of the same slugfest. The luster died, and the superhero died with it.
There were only three that endured, and that was Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman.
DC had faith in Wonder Woman's potential as a licensed property. Batman had already starred in 2 successful Saturday morning movie serials and guest starred on Superman's radio show. Superman, the first superhero, expanded his audience with tales of his youth in Smallville. Superman was a national symbol. In the early 40s, Superman's mission was defined one way.
Superman fights a never-ending battle for truth and justice.
By the 1950s and the introduction of the Superman television show, of course, it became
Truth, justice, and the American way.
That phrase, the American way, was all over the place in the 1950s, because now we're stuck in a Cold War.
But as Superman entered the 1950s, more popular than ever, his creators, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, were out of the business. A few years earlier, they had sued DC in an attempt to reclaim the rights to Superman and to get millions in royalties they said the company owed them. In 1948, they lost their suit, and DC let them go.
Jerry Siegel was essentially fired from the strip that he had created.
At least Siegel and Shuster were out of the line of fire when the comic book business came under attack.
A psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham suddenly got on a soapbox and began preaching against comic books.
Born in Munich, Wortham had been the senior psychiatrist at New York's Bellevue Hospital, as well as the director of a low-cost psychiatric clinic in Harlem. In the 1940s, he began conducting his own studies into abnormal behavior in young people.
He went around from prison to prison interviewing juvenile prisoners. And one of the questions we asked him was, what do you read? Well, he discovered that all of them read comics. Ergo, comics are destroying our society.
I think he had a genuine concern for kids.